Before I start, a quick message. This talk is going to talk about, amongst other things, the pandemic, trauma as a general concept, and my experiences as a disabled queer person. So quick content warnings for those things. And I'm also going to touch on some serious events that are having very devastating consequences for real people who matter, such as police brutality in America, Palestine, and the rise of extremist xenophobia globally. I'm not going to go too deep into these topics, but it feels like a disservice to the affected people to not at least acknowledge them. So free Palestine, queer, disabled, people of colour, Indigenous people, women, Jewish people, Muslim people, they all deserve so much better than this world is giving them. Let's look after ourselves and each other and the planet, because things are scary right now. Let's not contribute to that. Okay, so as you're all probably aware, things have been slightly eventful lately. We're living through what is called a polycrisis, a time of upheaval where several disasters are compounding off each other. We are expected to carry on as if everything is carrying on per normal, to work our jobs and pay our taxes as if we aren't living through some of the scariest years to be alive in modern history. $15 sandwiches are not going to pay for themselves after all. There is a link between the art that we create and how we create it with the political and social circumstances of the day. Some examples of this are the anti-war music of the 1960s and 2000s, and this includes our current polycrisis. I often make things. I'm primarily music, which I studied at university. Classical music and ambient music is what I primarily do. I am not including any of it in the talk today, not because I can't be bothered dealing with the headache that is media files and presentations, but because my music tends to lean more towards the avant-garde, and I know not everyone is into that, so if that's you, you're welcome. I also do photography, especially of birds. I really like taking photos of birds. I go to Zealandia fairly often, and yeah, it's a lovely time. I also sometimes dabble in visual art in multiple forms. Here are some of my pixel art stuff. And I also mess with image files by writing code. Here are a couple of my digital works. And I also sometimes make small games too. I generally don't do this for commercial reasons, and I generally don't share it on social media or anything, mostly because I don't want to place my dopamine production in the hands of algorithms and machines. But in the past few years, through lockdowns and everything else, my relationship to my art has changed a bit, and I have been doing some thinking. In the face of the pandemic and everything else, why do I make the stuff that I make? How can I make stuff in circumstances like these? Is there any value to what I'm doing? Is this the best use of my very limited time on this planet? Am I still enjoying this? And just why am I still doing this? I think I have answers to most of these questions now. So here are some reflections and realizations from trying to force a creative output during these fun past few years. Skip that slide. First thing to ask is, why should we create things? I'm more asking this of the hobbyists among us because the professionals of you have some pretty good incentives already. By the way, I live with my partner and a few pets. This isn't a family thing or anything. And this is one of 2 to 3 weekly shops. I don't know how anyone is meant to make a living in these circumstances. Creating things can be done for many different reasons, including reasons other than money and the lofty pursuit of high art. When I started studying composition at music school in 2012, which was over 10 years ago, oh God, the reasons were because I got really good grades for it in high school, and it was a means of expressing myself as a reclusive and awkward autistic 19-year-old. I was fully aware that there wasn't much stability in the classical field. My dad actually, when I was talking about going to university, left a newspaper interview with a local composer on the kitchen table. They went on about how every composer in New Zealand is broke and has no money. My dad hoped that I would read this and reconsider going to music school. I didn't, and he may have had a point, but my reasons for going were more personal than that, and I do not regret it. Even if whenever I look at my student loan updates, I can feel my blood pressure rising. There are a lot of other very different reasons why people get into art though, and they are valid. During the pandemic, I know several people who started tending a garden. This is, seriously, I'm not shoehorning the theme here. It was a way to build routine and normalcy when all of their old routines had to abruptly stop. It helped them through some of the roughest months of their lives, and they still do it today. I also know people who started gardening during the pandemic because flowers are pretty and they suddenly had a lot more time on their hands, which is equally valid even if it would look slightly out of place in a write-up in some pretentious art magazine. As for me, I did quite a bit of composing in 2020. It was a nice distraction from a lot of the really scary things that were happening. I could sit in front of a digital audio workstation for several hours, and I would have a little bit of music to listen to at the end of it. Of course, sometimes the screen at the end of those several hours would look much the same as it did at the start, but it was several hours I was not thinking about the pandemic and all of the people who I miss dearly. I still got something very tangible from that experience. The point is, there are many different reasons to get into art, other than money and, to create things. It is a means of self-expression. You can do it for fun, you can do it to impress a lover. There are many good reasons and very few bad ones. It's mostly just money. You just kind of need to do it. One thing to mention to artists is you do not need to monetize your hobbies. In our capitalist society, there is a pressure to strip mine ourselves and of time for everything that it is worth. Now, I understand why people turn their hobbies into careers. I really do. Not just for the obvious cost of living reasons, again, $15 sandwiches, but also because of the old saying that if you do what you love, you will never work a day in your life. One of the many problems with this saying is that turning your craft into a career changes your relationship with it. And if you happen to freelance, then it adds a whole bunch of overhead and bureaucracy to it. You have to deal with stuff like taxes, dealing with clients, dealing with bad clients, dealing with social media, which I don't know why anyone would want to do that these days, and a whole bunch of other stuff. I have looked at becoming a composer as a career, but I decided against it because as soon as I tried, it turned into work. When trying to compose stuff for non-personal reasons and because it would look good on a portfolio, it became a lot less fun. And as I was dealing with the pandemic and personal responsibilities and my job, on top of everything else, I just did not have the time for that drudgery, and I decided that the financial stability of a corporate job was better for me. You can still work a corporate career and make things as a hobby. You won't make as much stuff as people who create art full-time, but it means that you get to create what you want to create on your terms. This is not me saying don't go into art. There are other reasons to not go into art, like money. But if you do try and turn your craft into a career, then I do wish you the best of luck. But I just wish to emphasize that if you have the means to keep your creative work as a hobby, you do not have to pursue it as a career. You will not be any less of an artist to do so. Let's talk a bit about legacy and prestige. They are topics that many artists think about at some point, and it's easy to understand why. They're very romantic topics to talk about. Talking about how cool and important your work is so much more exciting than talking about how burnt out you are. And talking about the hypothetical impact of your work in 20, 50, 200 years' time is so much nicer than talking about how you spent several hours trying to create something and nothing happened. Not to mention the prospect of some part of me living on in memory once I cark it is one that I found very comforting over the past few years. Slides are updated. I wouldn't think too hard about legacy or prestige, though. Everything is currently much too uncertain. This is not to say that hoping some of your work outlives you is a bad thing. Keep dreaming that dream by all means. I just don't think it is something that you should pay too much attention to when deciding what it is that you want to work on, and there are several reasons for this. First of all, we are in a media climate where we are so saturated with content served algorithmically that getting something noticed, it's a lottery. If you come from money, then your chances of winning are certainly higher, but the reasons why stuff blows up is often arbitrary. There's no rhyme or reason behind it. Just look at the video game hits of this year if you want proof of that. And having something blow up is no guarantee that you'll be able to, do it again. So much of it is luck these days. I'm sure many artists in here can relate to, pouring their heart and soul into something for dozens of hours, only to finally post it on social media and it does nothing. But a quick draft that they farted out in 10 minutes goes extremely viral. Also, life is too short to worry about legacy. We don't know what is going to happen in the future. And unless you are creating to put food on the table, creating for more extrinsic motivations like legacy and prestige, rather than more intrinsic motivations like fun and personal satisfaction, might be a waste of time that is more limited than we would expect. Yes, I lost friends in the pandemic, how'd you guess? Live in the moment and make stuff that you want to make. People can turn their noses up at fan works and all that, but if you want to make fan art or fan fiction, then do it. If you want to turn all of your creative energy into making garbage memes for the friend group Discord server, do it. Unless you're being paid to create something specific, in which case you should probably do what you're being paid to do, or you're working towards a specific goal like trying to develop specific skills or get a job at a specific workplace, I would first and foremost encourage you to create what you want to create rather than what you feel like you should create. Another aspect of legacy to talk about in our current times is that if you are making a personal legacy-defining work about some world event, that work's position in the cultural zeitgeist will be more influenced by that event than it will be by you. This is not an issue if you're creating work for activism purposes, which I'll talk about later, but if you're making a work exploring your inner world in relation to some kind of crisis, then it might be. To give an example, how many of you remember Bo Burnham's Inside? The Netflix musical that was very popular during the pandemic, won a ton of awards, got Burnham halfway to an EGOT. When was the last time you thought about Bo Burnham's Inside? And now that I've brought it up, what is the first thing that you think about and how does it make you feel? Did you think about Burnham's skits and his antics and smile? Or did you think about the pandemic and just cringe ever so slightly? I'm willing to bet a lot of you did the latter, even though I reference a specific work by name. Just something to keep in mind if you are trying to create work about current events. The main thing I would pay attention to legacy is that you don't throw yours in the bin somehow. I'm not going to name names, but I can think of many artists that have made major contributions to their field and made some truly beloved work that are now best known for being pretty terrible people. The main thing is, so long as your hypothetical or actual Wikipedia page doesn't detail your list of extensive list of violent crimes, or have a whole section dedicated to how much you hate one or more marginalized groups, you're doing all right. That's the main thing I want to point out with regards to legacy. Next, I'm going to talk a bit about some of the barriers to creativity that I had during the polycrisis, especially the pandemic, and what I went to get around them. I had a lot of pretty bad creative drought during the pandemic, and as I don't know if I did mention this earlier, I've changed besides. I found it hard to do creative work due to stress from living in the polycrisis and dealing with my other responsibilities. This is very normal. When something bad happens and someone's always like, oh, this is going to lead to so much great art. Generally no, because as it turns out, living through disasters is really exhausting, and nothing kills creativity like being exhausted. I know many artists who have gone through serious creative blocks during the pandemic, and sure, it is frustrating to turn on your creative faucet, only for nothing to come out, and when you finally have a few hours to actually do something, but it is nothing to be ashamed about. What helped me in this scenario is to just have a break, to read a book, play video games, go for a lovely walk outside, and just not try and force it. If the well is truly dry and your livelihood doesn't depend on putting something to paper in the next 5 minutes, have a break. It is so much more helpful, not just for the quantity and quality of my creative output, but also for mental health, because as it turns out, being through serious life-changing events is very damaging to that. And Another issue that I've had with the pandemic is that big projects felt much too daunting. As my capacity to work was shot from stress, and there was also just worry that I might not be able to finish the bigger project. One thing that helped was to work on anthologies of smaller works. I'm not going to go too huge into things I have made during this talk, but I have a couple of anthologies going on right now. One is a collection of ambient pieces of music that are made only from sine waves, and the other main one is a collection of human-made pastiches of AI art, which, to be clear, made by me, not by machine, that I made by stitching together public domain images in an image editor. I call them my computer animals. Instead of trying to work on a bigger piece of art and getting nothing done, I worked on small pieces, and now I have a pretty substantial amount of work done, one that rivals the size of a bigger piece of art. This is a win considering the alternative was me just being overwhelmed and doing nothing. And working on small pieces gave me the opportunity to practice a wide range of skills and try different things. If writing a piece of music that's an hour long, you have less avenue to try and experiment, because if you try too many things, you will end up with an incoherent mishmash of stuff. And incoherent mishmashes of stuff can be great, but unless that's what you're deliberately trying to create, then that is a situation best avoided. And while you could take a break from your big project to work on smaller projects, you now have multiple projects going on at the same time, and speaking from personal experience, when you're working on multiple projects at the same time, very few get done. And the amount that you have to be doing at once in order for that to be a problem is smaller than you might expect it to be. To give an example of how working on smaller anthologies of works helped me practice different skills, working on an album of sine wave ambient music really forced me to think hard about texture and timbre in ways that I hadn't before. And that playing around with that has translated to my other work, which is really neat. And once everything is settled down, I hope to use these skills to create something bigger. Another difficulty with creating art these days is that everything is really expensive. And when the cost of essentials is so high, the cost of buying tools and lessons to do our craft is a lot less justifiable. But there are things that can be done to mitigate this somewhat. To give an example, some fields are cheaper to enter than others. Some disciplines like photography are going to require a fairly heavy investment up front no matter what you do. But for something like pixel art, which I do sometimes, the only money that I've spent on that is on a copy of a program called Sprite, which I spent $10 on when it was on sale, and that's the only money I've spent on creating pixel art. Some people even use Microsoft Paint to create pixel art, and while I would recommend going with a more feature-complete product that has a bunch of nice features that can handle things like transparency and animations and all that, it is still fully usable for that purpose. You also do not need to buy the most expensive equipment when starting out. You can look for cheaper alternatives. Look around, ask around, and see what you can find. If you're getting into digital art, you do not need to shell out for an expensive Adobe subscription that will cost very large amounts of money over time just to use Photoshop. There are cheaper alternatives, the main one being Clip Studio Paint, which costs $80 once. If you're looking for a digital audio workstation, rather than going with Pro Tools, which costs $1,000 a year, which is ridiculous, look into something like Reaper, which is still very powerful and in some ways better. But it costs 370 New Zealand dollars once, and if you are not making that much money from your music, then it is only $100. There is no reason to go with something so expensive. If you're getting into photography, please do not buy a $10,000 camera when starting out. It is ridiculous. You do not need it. An entry-level $1,000 camera will serve you nicely and still allow you to take a lot of fantastic photos. And if you ignore this warning and do decide to buy a $10,000 camera when starting out, when you are selling it at a deep discount, because as it turns out you're just not that into photography, please let me know, and I'm sure we can arrange a deal for me to take it off your hands. You can also look into open source software, a lot of it which is very good. And while some open source software does have a reputation for needing some design work, some of it is as good and as usable as products that you would spend hundreds of dollars on. For example, for music notation, I would recommend using MuseScore over any of the paid alternatives. It's free, genuinely powerful, probably the most user-friendly option, and unlike some premium notation software that I had to use in music school, it doesn't crash every 5 minutes, which, as it turns out, is really nice. I really like that. I like my software not crashing. Try to buy things on sale. For stuff like audio suites and libraries that get really expensive really quickly, I will wait until a sale to pick them up. Even a 20% discount on something that costs hundreds of dollars, that is a fairly significant amount of money saved. And for those who are buying audio libraries, especially look on Black Friday, it's a really good time to do so. For photography, remember that you don't have to buy things new. You can buy second-hand gear. When I bought my DSLR camera, my acronyms, I bought it new as part of a Boxing Day sale. I saved $400 that way. But most of my lenses are second-hand, and I've saved quite a bit of money just not buying them new. You really don't need to do that. And while you could go to art school, and there are very, very valid reasons why you might do so despite the costs, though that is a whole other talk that I'm not going to get into, there are countless free tutorials out there on YouTube and other places. You just need to look for them. And you can also ask your peers for help. I learned photography because I have a friend who's really into it, and when I got my camera, we went on photography adventures together and she showed me the ropes, and taking photos of auroras, derelict bunkers, and more. I essentially got a free course in photography just because I had a friend who was really interested in it and was happy to share their knowledge with other people. Next thing that I'm going to talk about is, with creating art in our current time, is using trauma to inspire art, something that most of us now unfortunately have ample amounts of. There are benefits to doing this. You know the subject matter and can speak from some position of authority. It's an excellent way to put yourself and your history into your work. You can raise awareness of serious issues, and you can help bring catharsis to people who have undergone similar. For example, when I had COVID back in 2022, one painting that very much occupied my thoughts was Edvard Munch's self-portrait with Spanish flu. It's a painting that just seems to ooze a sense of malaise, with a colour scheme that is muted yet features a lot of really sickly greens and yellows. Parts of it almost look mouldy to me, like the green on the chair. Munch's blurred and washed out appearance really conveys a sense of exhausted delirium that I was really feeling at the time, and having COVID and being forced to be alone when I felt absolutely horrible, it sucked. And weirdly, this painting helped make me feel a bit less alone. Other people have gone through this, and I would get through this. When creating work inspired by our trauma, though, can be complicated. Let's first talk about the many small traumas that all of us will have accumulated over the years. These can infuse your work with a sense of personality and relatability. Like the time in primary school where after a rainy day, there was a big puddle on a field outside, and I wanted to impress a bunch of kids by trying to jump over it. When I ran up to the puddle, I slipped, ate a bunch of mud, much to the laughter of my peers. At the time, it was horrifically embarrassing and my life was over. But give it enough time, and that story has become seasoning that I've sprinkled into my talk at Play by Play 2024. When we're talking about including trauma in our art, though, we're not usually talking about the little things. We're usually talking about the kind of trauma that can wreck your day because you heard a few seconds of a song that was playing in the worst moments of your life. The kind of trauma that stops you from feeling safe in your own bed. Let's talk about that trauma. So I have tried writing about some of the more horrible things that I've been through and elements of the past few years that have been most directly relevant to me. I'm not going to talk about these in detail here, but I bring this up because while this talk is personal experience, I especially want to emphasize that now. One of the main things about using trauma to inspire your art is that it really requires you to stew in your most horrible moments. Creativity, it takes time, and the subject matter will by necessity take up a large portion of your headspace for a while. And this isn't even counting things like editing and tweaking your work, which unless you're going to just throw first draft of whatever you've created online, you're going to need to do. And that's not even counting in games QA, which even the most basic Twine game is going to need QA. And let me tell you, replaying your most traumatic moments in a video game because you're trying to find bugs, it's something from a Black Mirror episode. I don't recommend it. And while it is possible to find catharsis in this kind of work, it is brutal. There are things you can do to minimize the impact of this. You can ask someone to proofread and edit your work. Just make sure they know what they're getting into and they're compensated well for their time. You can write about these events happening to someone else instead of writing about your experience. You're not telling your horrible story, you're a subject matter expert that is telling a story about some fictional character. This can help a distance between you and the work, which can make this easier. You can also lift parts of your experience rather than including the whole thing. If there's some details that are just especially painful, then leave those out. It will do you a lot of good to just not touch them at this stage if you're not ready to do so. Whatever you do, though, this work is a slog, and there is so much other stuff you can do instead. I could write a Twine game about these childhood experiences, or this Elden Ring game seems pretty good. I could drag myself through a desolate hellscape filled with darkness and misery around every corner, or I could play one of the best games of 2022. I ended up playing a lot of Elden Ring, and those projects remain uncompleted to this day. So just keep that in mind if you are going to create art about your trauma. Another thing to keep in mind is that when creating work that comes from such a personal space, people are going to criticize it. Now, this seems obvious, yes, but if you haven't really thought too deep about that, there are some additional considerations to keep in mind. One thing that's going to be judged on is technical execution. And having something that comes from such a personal place, having that dismissed because it contains a couple of typos or something, feels really horrible, especially when you weren't thinking about that when you finished it. There have been times where I have given a presentation and afterwards someone would come up to me and say, "Oh, but I wish you spoke with more emotion." I'm autistic. I often speak with a deadpan voice. I just do it. It's not on purpose. And I need to actively inject emotion into my speech. If I don't, the whole thing will be this a monologue of this. And I understand the point. And I do welcome technical criticism if it's constructive, but the main thing is to just expect it. Just remember, you can tell the most eloquent story, and there will be someone who will criticize it because it's locked to 60 frames per second. So just be prepared for it. And when you create work about emotionally charged topics like your trauma and your experiences as a minority, you will receive feedback, and that feedback can range from useful and constructive to put it charitably, disposable. When I get unsolicited feedback, I ask myself, would I go to this person for advice? Is this someone who actually knows what they're talking about? Or is this just some random person on the internet? And how many insults are there in that feedback? If the answers aren't satisfactory, then it's getting ignored. And just remember, you get to choose what feedback you want to take on. And while I would advise taking on feedback from your manager at your job, the reckons of random strangers online are much less important. And last of all, you are not obligated to talk about your trauma. If you're a creative from a marginalized background, there is a pressure to talk about your trauma, and this can include pressure to include details about your life on grant applications, which might explain why you need a grant and can help you increase the chances of succeeding. And it also includes the fact that most successful artists from a marginalized group will talk about their experiences, sometimes demonstrating remarkable vulnerability. It can sometimes feel like you need to do that too in order to be successful. And there has been stuff that I have shared about being a disabled queer person that I am wondering if it was better to have not done that. Now, discussions about the systematic marginalization of different groups of people, they are important and they need to be had. And it is important to promote the work of your peers. I want to give a quick shout out to the excellent talk that Piper gave earlier today. However, that does not mean that as a marginalised person, you owe people your life story. It belongs to you, and it's up to you who you share it with and how much you share. If you want to talk about your trauma, then please do so. Just make sure that it is on your terms and on your terms only. Another thing that I've been contending with is that when creating my little beeps and boops, it felt pretty meaningless and frivolous in the face of war, disease, genocide, and xenophobia. If I had time to make things, then surely I had time to volunteer. If I had the money to buy new gear, then surely that money would be better spent buying food for people in war zones. Now, I want to be clear. This problem is minor and no way equal to the other problems that I mentioned whatsoever. I am not trying to claim that at all. This is very much a middle-class person in New Zealand kind of problem. When it comes to creating stuff in my spare time, though, it is absolutely something that I have been grappling with, so I'm going to talk a bit about it. Volunteering. It's important. If you are able to, find a group doing good work and help out. I have volunteered for several groups over the past few years. The Games Festival, yes, but also queer groups, disability groups, and more. I am thrilled to do that work, but it is indeed work, and some of it has been rough. I'm not going to go into specifics because I don't owe you my trauma, but I have some horror stories and I have seen way too many peers burn out. One thing that I can attribute towards not doing the same is art. One of the most important skills that you need to have when doing activism-related stuff is being able to step back when you need to. Because if you go all in all the time, you will burn out, you'll end up either completely exhausted or jaded and bitter. I've seen it happen to too many people. Writing music is something that I do for me when I need to take a step back. And it has definitely helped ground and centre myself in when times have been difficult. It is part of the reason I'm not currently pursuing music as a career. I would not be able to do that if I was. Also, as a quick side note, if you are interacting with volunteers, don't be a jerk. The kind of people who would yell obscenities at waiters, which also unacceptable, will also do that to volunteers, even ones doing work in uncontroversial spaces like food kitchens. And it sucks. So just don't do that. You can also create art that advocates for different social causes. If you're an artist and you have some ennui about how much your work means in the face of all of our current issues, then you can always go political. It's free and easy to do. It is, now, if you are an artist who is, say, a composer and not a singer, then it can be a bit harder, but it is still possible. You just need to get a bit more creative with it. And if you do make the kind of work that doesn't really gel with that kind of thing, there are other things that you can do to help make the world a better place with your art. For example, one of the big things we've seen in games is charity bundles. Most notable ones recently being the Bundle for Racial Justice and Equality, and the various Palestine bundles that have been on itch. If you can, contributing your work to these is a way that you can help materially improve the world, and contributing financially to these as well. In the past, I have contributed music to charity albums to raise money for able gamers, which this might come as a surprise for someone who does accessibility work, but disabled people being able to play video games is a cause that matters to me a lot, so I do that. I believe that art is undervalued by our society these days. It isn't strictly essential. You can't live off cultural enrichment any more than you can live off something like exposure. And this means that art can often be treated as something of a luxury. If you are on welfare and you buy a video game or buy tickets to a movie or something, you can expect to be chastised by some people, many of whom haven't financially struggled for a day in their lives, but that's besides the point. While eating paintings would probably kill you, art is one of those things that makes life worth living. Going to an art gallery and seeing something exciting and unexpected can be the spark that one needs in our often bleak 21st century lives. When I went to the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art earlier this year, I saw a painting that consisted of many, many different layers of paint to create oozy 3D shapes, and it looks really cool. It was something that I hadn't seen before and was unexpected, and it managed to spark some genuine whimsy that had long been missing. Art can also be a source of comfort in difficult times. I'm not going to go into details, but when I was going through a rough patch a couple of months ago, I played a lot of a game called Balatro. You've probably heard of it. If you haven't, it's a game where you break the rules of poker to make really big numbers, and as it turns out, making really big numbers is an excellent distraction. Balatro is very much a video game for the sake of being a video game, but being able to distract myself from a big dangling sword above my head by making big numbers was invaluable. It helped me get through that rough month. And there's also the joy of seeing yourself being represented in media. The first time I saw an autistic character in a piece of media that wasn't a punchline was To the Moon, which, I have my criticisms of that game, yes, but prior to that, all I had to go on was stuff like What's Eating Gilbert Grape, which I had to watch in high school. And I hate that movie. It is overrated, but just art is undervalued, and it really is a pursuit that is so often treated as disposable content rather than a very vital part of our lives. The last thing that I want to talk about today is burnout, which, as I mentioned earlier, our capacity to work is much lower during stressful times. Here is a reminder to please look after yourselves and take breaks when you need to. Burnout isn't just feeling tired for a day. It is a deep-seated exhaustion that can last for months and just be a really rough time. Some things to keep an eye on when looking for if you're burnt out. Energy levels, how well you remember things, how irritable or apathetic you are, and how much pressure you can deal with. But this is a huge topic that I don't have the time to go super deep into. But if you are burnt out, all you can really do is just stop doing so much and have a break. This sucks if you're a workaholic or volunteer a lot, but it's necessary. It is what you need to do. You need to have an actual break. Art is not essential to live, but both creating our own work and enjoying the work of others is a great way to enrich our lives, especially in our polycrisis where everything is really stressful right now, even if cost of living can make that more difficult. If you do art or have been looking at taking up a craft, then I hope this talk has been helpful. Look after yourselves and create some awesome stuff.